Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and this video is about the Black and Tans. Now, I have to call them that name, that pejorative name, because if I were to use the proper name, nobody would know who I was talking about. They're really the Royal Irish Constabulary Special Reserve. So they were given this name to damage their reputation, to make them seem ludicrous. There was a journalist in Clare who dubbed them that, and it was after a local pack of hounds. So people had a good laugh at their expense. Although I think the dogs were some hunting pack in Tipperary, not in Clare. And then there was a comic at the Theatre Royal in Limerick who brought the house down when he retailed that joke. So there was a conflict in Ireland, particularly 1919 to 21, and the IRA, that's the Irish Republican Army, was this an ultra-nationalist organisation and existed in a clandestine manner, mostly, sometimes openly, and fighting the Crown forces. That was the Royal Irish Constabulary, or police, and the British Army. And so that stage of the conflict was from January 1919 until the truce on the 11th of July 1921. So the IRA first of all started attacking the RIC in their little stations in the countryside when there were just a few police officers who were quite vulnerable. And so law and order in certain counties broke down quite quickly, and some RIC guys were retiring anyway. There's a natural attrition, people dying of natural causes, obviously RIC officers getting killed, others invalided out, others resigning for fear of being shot, or indeed because they were somewhat in sympathy with what the IRA were doing. The IRA wanted to break the whole of Ireland out of the United Kingdom and set up a republic. So to fill the gaps in the RIC, men were recruited, mainly in Great Britain, and they came over, and they're the RIC Special Reserve. So they came over, first of all, in March 1920, and they had to be veterans of the First World War. It's important to emphasise just how much the First World War overshadowed this. People had got accustomed to the use and sight of arms, the kind of thing Patrick Pearse had prophesied and prayed for only a few years earlier. So it's fair to say that the RIC Special Reserve have a public image problem in Ireland, and more than a few people detest them. Now, I never met a member of this force. I've spoken to someone who did know a man who was in it, and saying, well, there's only a few guys who are doing all this bad stuff. So these police officers had all served in the First World War, as I said, mostly in the Army, occasionally in the Royal Navy or even the RAF. And they had almost no police training before they came to Ireland, had to really learn it on the job, but they were not there to carry out ordinary policing duties like dealing with cattle rustling, pickpockets and lost children. It was really to fight the IRA, to reinforce the RIC in the stations where the RIC were really under pressure or being ambushed by the IRA and their police stations being stormed at night. The auxiliaries came along in July 1920, which they were quite often mistaken, and people blur them together. There's not a great difference between the two forces. So it's long said that the first casualty of war is truth, and I think it was the Irish journalist William Howard Russell who came up with that maxim, and too true it is. So the RIC Special Reserve suffer a bad reputation. And the IRA wanted to assassinate them, but also wanted character assassination as well, to besmirch their enemy as much as possible, to say they're absolute monsters and we must fight these fiends, and any decent person would try to defend his homeland from these barbarians. And the myth got around that they were the scrapings of English jails. Now, because they joined the police, someone would have been ipso facto rejected from the force if they had a criminal record. Apparently, a very, very few guys with a criminal record slipped through the net. By the way, there are only ever 7,000 members of this force, not all at the same time. The peak was a bit lower than that. Some people obviously were killed, invalided out, some resigned, some were sacked, and only 2/3 of them were still at the end. So because they've been through the First World War, some of them have been shell-shocked. Many would be suffering from what we now recognise as post-traumatic stress disorder, which wasn't recognised at all at the time. And some people who suffered from that were executed in the Second World War for refusing to go forward in an attack. So they would have had physical and mental scars. The physical scars couldn't be too bad. They had to have 4 limbs, otherwise they wouldn't be able to execute their duties. So they had to go around manning roadblocks, searching houses, trying to disrupt enemy activity, catch wanted IRA man. This was an irregular conflict. Now, there was some Hibernophobia in Great Britain at the time, mustn't be exaggerated, some anti-Catholicism. Obviously, there's a bit of a spike in this because of the conflict, a bit of Anglophobia and anti-Protestantism that increased in Ireland. At the time, the sectarian divide deepened back then. Probably the institutions which Catholics and Protestants got along best were the Crown Forces. That means the British Army and the RIC. So I often read the accusation that the RIC Special Reserve there to terrorise civilians. There was this irregular conflict going on, and it's true that these policemen sometimes did kill civilians. Ideally, that would never ever happen. They were there to fight the IRA, which necessarily involved killing them, and they did that, and the IRA killed them. None of that surprising. So the IRA was an insurgent force, and they almost never wore uniforms, because that was one of their main advantages, blending in with the civilian population. Unlike an ordinary conflict, the RIC couldn't tell friend from foe or civilians, and so they didn't think this man might draw a gun at me at any time. So they were very jumpy, and they're very trigger happy. And so some civilians would have been killed by accident. Were civilians deliberately killed, knowing them to be civilians? And there were some cases where that happened, and that would be murder. So that did happen. Of the 7,000 men who were in the RIC Special Reserve, how many committed this? I would think very, very few. Ideally, it would be none, but we've got to be realistic. In a conflict of this nature, a guerrilla conflict, it always happens. Can anyone think of examples that it didn't happen? It shouldn't happen, and obviously should be prosecuted. So they would obviously try and rake through areas of countryside where the IRA would only be very active to try and catch them and keep the IRA on the back foot by carrying out these sweeps. And if they found weapons hidden or a wanted man in a house, they would often burn it down. This was without official sanction at first. Later on, the government gave that policy their imprimatur, saying, well, this is no longer a house, it's an enemy arsenal or barracks and so on. And if we don't do it, they simply do it again. And it applies to discourage people from doing likewise. So people were given usually 2 hours to get all their possessions out of the house, and then it'd be burnt down. Unsurprisingly, people who had their houses burnt down did not like it. But now, some people would defend that policy, but it went further. If there was an attack, sometimes members of the RIC would burn down any houses nearby on the basis, well, you must have known about this and didn't tip us off. Well, it's an unsafe assumption that the local inhabitants were aware an attack was in the offing. Moreover, if they had tipped them off, they would have been killed by the IRA, and that quite happened, and often happened. The IRA had no compunction about killing people like, say, Mrs. Lindsay, who informed the Crown Forces of operations of this nature. And the IRA in Cork were particularly vicious, killing over 100 civilians whom they claimed to be spies. There was spy mania. They were absolutely paranoid in Cork. By contrast, at that same time, the Belfast IRA didn't kill a single person as an alleged informer. So there was certainly gross misconduct from a number of members of the RIC Special Reserve. Obviously, it's hugely inflated by people who've got an ideological bias here and say that there were absolute demons. You've got to compare it to counterinsurgencies that were going on at roughly this time. Let's say in Morocco, in Serbia during the First World War, the Austro-Hungarian army capturing soldiers, Serbian soldiers who were actually fighting in a properly constituted army and even hanging them with a slow drop, or particularly agonizing death, which is a really barbaric thing to do. The Russian Civil War, with their partisans on both sides. The Mexican Civil War was going on at the time, fighting in Silesia between Polish and German nationalists at the time, not actual legal armies. The Ottoman Empire had been struggling with various insurrections around this time. So I'm afraid to say that brutality was the order of the day. Obviously, killing an enemy soldier in combat, I don't think that counts as brutal in the context of an armed conflict, but deliberately killing civilians does. So in many cases, if somebody was found to be harbouring rebels in other countries, he or even she would have been killed on the spot. Whereas I don't think this ever happened in Ireland. I could be mistaken, but usually it was destruction of property, which certainly by the standards of the time was mild. So when IRA men were captured, there's anecdotal evidence they were beaten up. I've read memoirs of lots of IRA men like Tom Barry and Ernie O'Malley, and they recorded sometimes being beaten up, sometimes not. Policemen beating up suspects in major crimes was quite common at the time and happened going on in the Republic of Ireland to the 1970s and other countries and the UK. I'm not saying it's acceptable. We just have to say that was the norm. Not particularly bad. Actual torture depends what you count as actual torture. Tom Barry alleges 2 guys were tortured, and I really do think only 2, having their fingernails pulled out, which is obviously a very gruesome thing to do. So over 20,000 IRA prisoners were killed, and only 24 were executed. Now sometimes IRA men were killed whilst in custody, and the explanation would be he tried to escape. And then Republicans will dismiss this out of hand. Well, is it not possible a guy did try and make a break for it or grab somebody's gun? The IRA will obviously boast about all their audacious escapes. So I think that these official explanations shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. There's this Republican ballad, The Rifles of the IRA, and it says about the RIC Special Reserve, they cut down wives and children. Well, did they kill a single woman? Did they kill a single child? I'm not aware of a single one. I might be wrong. Maybe there are, but if there are, there would be very, very few. It's true the auxiliaries killed a woman at Croke Park when I think it's 14 people were shot in Bloody Sunday in the end of 1920, and the auxiliaries often lumped in with the RIC Special Reserve. So the counterinsurgent forces are obviously fighting in very difficult circumstances because they can't detect their enemy, and the enemy doesn't have identifiable bases usually. And Montgomery wrote in his memoirs, it tends to lower standards of chivalry, not say, oh, well, he's a soldier, we'll treat him with certain decency. The IRA were not wearing uniforms, so they were outside the Geneva Convention, and if caught, could be executed on the spot as franc-tireurs. And again, that almost never happened. In that sense, they were treated very leniently, sometimes interned in places like the Curragh or Ballyconlar, County Down, or just occasionally put on trial. So the use of the death penalty was not promiscuous at this time at all, considering it was actually very, very sparing. So the IRA certainly killed civilians in large numbers, as I pointed out, engaged in a sectarian conflict in the north, killing, well, about 150 Protestant civilians at the time. Then there was the Ulster Protestants Association, which was a vicious sectarian outfit, a loyalist outfit, and they murdered hundreds of Catholic civilians. So the IRA certainly burnt down houses of unionists. How would you know someone was a unionist? Well, some people had been openly unionist a few years before. The South obviously was a very dangerous thing to be. So I think they would have simply guessed, well, someone says a Protestant, probably a unionist. This guy served with the government in some cases, was a magistrate a few years ago, so we'll burn his house, things like that. But those who castigate the RIC Special Reserve never seem to criticise the IRA for doing something similar. So fighting in the dark. The RIC were obviously jumping, patrolling in the dark, and would call on people to halt. And if a man didn't halt, they would usually shoot, and sometimes he would be killed. And so local people were outraged if a popular man was shot dead for failing to halt, saying, oh, this is murder, and so on. You can see why the RIC were quite jumpy. Because so-and-so, why is he not halting? Is he a wanted man? Is he about to pull a gun on us? You know, put myself in his situation. If I'm called upon to halt, I might panic and think, they're about to shoot me, I better scarper. And then that gets you shot. Anyway, so the things they did, the house blocks and road searches were unpopular. And I don't start from the assumption that they were always morally upstanding. I realise they could be discourteous. And some of them might be unpleasant characters. And they were aware. In certain counties, the IRA had considerable support. I would say majority support in places like West Cork and South Tipperary, where the IRA were most active. Then IRA propagandists would say the RIC behaved like the Germans in Belgium. Well, I'm not anti-German at all, but 1914, the first month or so of the war, about 6,000 Belgian civilians were killed by the German military, deliberately killed, as in we'll round up all the men in the village, put them against the wall, and we'll shoot them all dead because there's one sniping attack. Nothing remotely like that occurred in Ireland, not in scale, not in nature, not cold-bloodedly rounding people up when it had a lot of time to calm down and killing them in huge numbers. So it's a stinking lie to say it was in any sense comparable. There were serious breaches of discipline in the RIC Special Reserve, and they are written about scathingly by many historians, and many politicians at the time denounced them. I don't just mean the Home Rule Party or Sinn Féin. Let's remember the IRA had been vociferously pro-German in 1916 and for about a year afterwards. And the most lurid stories were told. A Labour MP said this, one of the House of Commons, that the Special Reserve captured some IRA men and cut off the ear of one and the nose of the other and the heart of another, which I think is complete bunkum. I mean, I haven't had any particulars about that. There were claims that they used to go around inebriated on duty, and being drunk whilst on duty would be completely against regulations and stupid, because then you wouldn't be able to aim properly. So I'm not saying it never happened. If it did happen, I would imagine very, very rare. But they often used to sing lustily as they went around in their lorries, which might have made people guess that they were drunk. So I suppose what happened is people saw the worst behaviour ever of one of these men and assumed that they were all like that. So that's what people do, try and use exceptionally bad behaviour to say it typifies the whole lot. And I'm not saying that they were angels on the whole. They had a difficult and rough job to do. They were fighting, and there was not a clean fight. Can fights ever be clean? But particularly in this case. So Tom Barry, IRA commander, he says in their lorries they would shoot at a random farmer to miss him, just to frighten him, but eventually they'd shoot him and kill him. He provided no corroborating information whatsoever. Who was shot like this? When? Where? Tom Barry knew West Cork like the back of his hand. Other events in his book, he's got chapter and verse on, but there are no particulars here. So the Special Reserve, they achieved just limited success. Some local reverses inflicted on the IRA. It wasn't going particularly well for them by July 1921, and the British government tried to improve discipline, improve their reputation, but again, that was too little too late, really. So many people have a deeply entrenched prejudice against them. But let's look back. Supposing you're running a counterinsurgency, what would be an acceptable and indeed effective counterinsurgency strategy? What would you do? And inevitably there are going to be breaches of discipline, and I think these weren't dealt with firmly enough in the early days. Because if you were running a counterinsurgency, would you burn down the houses of people who were hiding wanted men or weapons? Try and lay aside your own political beliefs, because you might say the IRA's cause was righteous. Suppose it was another situation in another country. What would you think was acceptable? So I think the allegations against them should be examined dispassionately each time. And I'm not pretending there was no wrongdoing whatsoever. I've stated that. What I'm saying is that the level of wrongdoing, the frequency of the wrongdoing is hugely exaggerated and decontextualized. To say that they were savage and so on is a travesty of the truth, whilst not pretending that there were no crimes committed by certain members of this force.